He had seen it happen 100 times in 100 dusty towns. A quiet cruelty, delivered with the bland efficiency of a transaction. Cole watched from the shade of the livery stable, his black horse, Night, shifting patiently beneath him. The woman stood at the counter of Gable's General Mercantile, her back ramrod straight. She wore a grey prairie dress, washed so many times it had surrendered its color to the relentless sun, the fabric thin and patched at the elbows. Her hands, clasped before her, were steady, but he could see the tension in the line of her shoulders. She was Chinese, and in this town, that was a currency that bought you only suspicion. Mr. Gable, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, was shaking his head slowly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wei," he said, his voice carrying on the still summer air, a performance of regret for the other customers. "The ledger is the ledger. No more credit until your husband's account is settled." The woman, Mai Lin, did not argue. She simply gave a small, sharp nod, a gesture of acceptance that was more damning than any protest. She had a few coins in her palm, a pathetic little constellation of copper and nickel. She pushed them forward. "For rice, then. Just a small bag for the children." Gable made a show of counting them, his thick fingers scooping them up. He sighed, a theatrical puff of air. "This won't cover a full bag. Not even a half." Rules are rules. He pushed the coins back toward her, a dismissal. He turned to the next customer, a rancher's wife with a full basket, and the smile finally touched his eyes. "Now, Mrs. Albright, what can we get for you today?" Mai Lin stood there for a moment, invisible. Then she gathered her dignity, wrapped it around herself like a shawl, and turned. She walked out of the store, her head held high, but Cole saw the slight tremor in her hands as she retied the strings of her empty cloth sack. She did not look at anyone. She walked as if she expected the dust itself to reject her. Cole waited until she was a dozen paces down the street, her small figure stark against the glare of the afternoon. He nudged Night with his heels, the horse moving into a slow, deliberate walk that matched her pace. He drew alongside her, keeping a respectful distance. She flinched when his shadow fell over her, her eyes darting to the holstered gun on his hip before moving to his face. She braced herself for another kind of cruelty. He tipped his hat. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but clear. "Ride with me," he said. It was not a question. "I'll fill your table tonight." Her eyes, dark and weary, narrowed. She saw a tall man, weathered by the sun and the trail. He was not handsome in the way of town folk, but his face was carved with a kind of stark honesty. Still, she had learned that offers from strange men were never free. "I have no money to pay you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not asking for money," he replied, his gaze steady. "A man gets tired of his own cooking. You cook, I'll hunt. We'll call it an even trade." She studied him, searching for the lie, the hook hidden in the bait. She found nothing but a quiet intensity in his gaze. He was waiting for her answer, patient as a mountain. The image of her children's faces, their quiet hope for supper, rose in her mind. It was a weight that bent her pride. Finally, she gave that same small, sharp nod she had given the storekeeper. It was not surrender. It was a choice. "All right," she whispered. He dismounted in one fluid motion, a man who was more at home in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. He offered her a hand up onto Night's broad back, and for the first time, she accepted help. Her hand was small and calloused in his, and then it was gone. He swung up behind her, taking the reins, and they rode out of town, leaving the dust and the quiet cruelties behind. The ride was silent. Mai Lin sat stiffly, her hands gripping the front of the saddle, careful not to lean back against him. Cole kept a deliberate space between them, his presence a steady weight but not an intrusion. He could feel the rigid set of her spine, a wall she had built around herself brick by silent brick. They left the main track, following a smaller trail that wound through sunbaked scrub and rock. The land was harsh, but he saw the small signs of life she probably knew intimately, the hardy desert herbs, the tracks of a jackrabbit, the distant shimmer of a hidden spring. Her home was not a house so much as a stubborn suggestion of one. It was a small, sod-roofed cabin pressed against the side of a low butte, as if seeking shelter from the wind and the world. It was small, weathered, and poor, yet there was a fierce tidiness to it. A small patch of garden, meticulously weeded, showed rows of struggling corn and beans. A line of patched clothing, bleached white by the sun, fluttered from a rope. It was a place of immense effort, a testament to a will that refused to be broken. As they approached, the cabin door opened. A boy of about 10 stood there, holding a younger girl behind him. The boy's face was a miniature mask of his mother's composure, his eyes dark and watchful. He held a sharpened stick like a spear. The girl, no older than 5, peered around his leg, her expression one of wide, unabashed curiosity. My Lin slid from the horse before Cole could dismount to help her. She spoke to her children in a language he did not understand, her voice a soft, flowing current. The tension in her shoulders eased as she looked at them. The boy, did not lower his stick. His gaze was fixed on Cole, on the gun, on the stranger's face. "This is My Lin said, turning back to Cole. "And this is Leanne." Cole dismounted slowly, letting Knight's reins trail on the ground. The horse stood, placid and immense. He did not smile at the children, he knew it would be a lie they would see right through. He simply met the boy's gaze and gave a slow nod, a gesture of respect from one man to another. "And," he said, his voice acknowledging the boy's role as protector. He looked at the girl. "Leanne." Leanne shyly waved a tiny hand. And did not move. "I'll be back before sundown," Cole said to My Lin. He turned without another word, swinging back onto Knight and riding toward the low hills that shimmered in the heat. My Lin watched him go, a conflicted swirl of fear and a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of hope in her chest. She led her children inside. The cabin was a single room, scoured clean. A small table with 2 stools, 2 sleeping pallets on the floor. The shelves on the wall were almost bare. A small sack of flour, a tin of tea, a few withered potatoes. And looked at his mother, his expression full of questions he knew better than to ask. "Who is he, Mama?" "He is a man who offered a trade," she said, her voice carefully neutral. She began to prepare, taking out her sharpest knife, stoking the small fire in the hearth. She worked with an economy of motion, wasting nothing, her hands moving with a familiar grace. She was preparing for a meal she could not yet see, trusting a promise from a man she did not know. It was a greater gamble than any she had ever taken at Gable's store. The silence in the small cabin was thick with waiting. True to his word, the long shadows of dusk were just beginning to stretch across the land when Cole returned. He didn't ride up to the cabin door. He stopped 100 yards away, dismounted, and walked the rest of the way, leading Knight. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that this was their space, not his. He carried 2 fat rabbits, cleaned and skinned, hanging from a leather thong. In his other hand, he held his hat, filled with a cluster of wild onions and some broad-leafed greens he'd found near the spring. He stopped at the edge of the cleared yard and waited. My Lin came to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the offering and her expression remained unreadable, but a deep, hidden part of her unclenched. "Food. Real food. This should be enough," he said, his voice low. He held out the rabbits and the greens. She took them, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. His hand was rough, calloused, but there was a steadiness to it. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "The trade's not finished," he reminded her gently. "I've still got my portion to earn." He did not try to come inside. He set about his own work, moving with a quiet competence that spoke of a life lived outdoors. He led Knight to the small, rickety trough, which was nearly empty, and then began to unstrap his bedroll and gear. He saw the state of the woodpile, a meager collection of splintered branches. The axe leaning against it had a cracked, dangerously loose handle. He noted these things without comment, filing them away. He built a small fire for himself well away from the house, a silent statement that he would not presume upon her hearth. Inside, My Lin worked with a renewed purpose. The smell of stew soon began to fill the small cabin, rich and savory. And watched her, his suspicion slowly being eroded by the undeniable aroma of roasting meat. Leanne sat at the table, humming a little tune, her bare feet kicking rhythmically against the stool leg. When the stew was ready, rich with onions and tender rabbit, My Lin filled 3 bowls. Then she paused. She looked out the open door at the solitary figure by the fire, a silhouette against the deepening twilight. She took down a 4th bowl, the one that had belonged to her husband, the one she kept clean on the shelf but never used. She filled it to the brim, with the best pieces of meat. She handed it to An. "Take this to him," she said. And looked from the bowl to his mother. This was a significant act, and he knew it. He took the bowl carefully, his small hands wrapping around its warmth. He walked out of the cabin, his steps hesitant at first, then more certain. He approached Cole's fire and held out the offering. Cole looked up, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He saw the boy, the steaming bowl, and the unspoken message. He took it with a quiet, "Thank you," and gave a curt nod and retreated to the safety of the cabin, but he glanced back once over his shoulder. The stranger was eating, his head bowed slightly over the bowl, as if in prayer. It was one small thing. The first of many. The next morning, Cole was gone before the sun had fully risen. My Lin woke to find 2 full buckets of water beside the door, drawn from the spring half a mile away. The woodpile was now neatly stacked, twice its previous size, filled with seasoned mesquite he must have gathered in the dark. Leaning against it was the axe. She picked it up. The handle was new, smooth, and perfectly weighted, carved from a piece of ironwood and fitted so snugly it felt like it had grown there. There was no note, no word of explanation. The work spoke for itself. He returned that evening, this time with 3 fish strung on a willow branch. He accepted his portion of the meal in the same way, eating by his own fire. The silent routine established itself over the next few days. He would leave at dawn and return at dusk with something for the larder. A brace of quail. A sack of wild potatoes he dug from a dry riverbed. He never asked for more than his share of the meal. He never overstepped the invisible boundary he had drawn around their home. The children were the first to cross it. Leanne, emboldened by her natural curiosity, began to leave small gifts for him near his fire. A brightly colored feather. A perfectly round, smooth stone. A wildflower that wilted in the heat. He never failed to acknowledge them. He would pick up the stone and put it in his pocket with a serious expression, or thank her for the flower with a solemn nod. He understood the language of small things. And was a harder fortress to breach. He watched Cole with an unnerving intensity, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the way the man's hands were always gentle with the horse, the way he moved through the brush without a sound, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. One afternoon, Cole was mending a strap on his saddle. An approached, standing just at the edge of Cole's camp. "My father taught me to mend leather," and said, his voice a challenge. Cole didn't look up from his work. "Did he?" he said, his tone conversational. "He must have been a good man." He was, and said fiercely. "He was smart. He knew things." "I can see that," Cole said, finally looking at the boy. "He raised a son who knows how to watch over his family." The simple, direct praise caught An off guard. It was not flattery, it was a statement of fact. His defensiveness wavered. "The snares you set," and said, changing the subject. "They are different from the ones my father made." "Many ways to catch a rabbit," Cole said. "Show me yours." And so, the lessons began. Cole showed An how to read the subtle signs of the trail, how to find water, how to tie a knot that would not slip. He never condescended. He taught the boy as an equal, sharing his knowledge as a simple matter of fact. He was giving An back a piece of what he had lost, a man's guidance. An's resistance crumbled, not in a sudden collapse, but worn away slowly, one shared skill, one quiet moment of respect at a time. He stopped carrying the sharpened stick. He started asking Cole questions about the stars. The fortress had opened its gates. The reciprocation from My Lin remained silent, but it deepened. One evening, after a long day, Cole returned to find a small mending kit beside his bedroll. Inside was a needle, strong thread, and a small square of canvas, perfect for patching the worn knee of his denims. He had not spoken of the tear, she had simply noticed. Another evening, a tin cup of hot tea was waiting for him on a rock near his fire, fragrant and sweet. It was her way of speaking, a language of quiet care. He decided to ride into town for supplies. Salt, coffee, some flour. He did not tell her he was going for her, but they both knew it. As he rode through the dusty main street, he saw Gable standing on the porch of his store, watching him. Cole dismounted and went inside, his spurs ringing softly on the wooden floor. "Back again," Gable said, his smile thin. "Heard you were keeping company out at the old Way place." "I'm buying supplies," Cole said, ignoring the bait. He listed what he needed. Salt. Coffee. A 20-pound sack of flour. As Gable measured out the flour, he spoke in a low, confidential tone. "You know, it's a shame about that family. Lee, her husband, he was a hard worker. But he had a bad head for numbers. Ran up quite a bill before the fever took him." He tapped a large, leather-bound ledger on the counter. A very large bill. Cole's eyes were steady. "Is that so?" "Oh, yes," Gable said, enjoying himself. "I've been very patient. More patient than most would be. A poor widow and her children, it's a sad story." While he spoke, a customer paid for a length of rope with cash. Cole saw Gable's hand move almost invisibly. He dropped the coins in the cash drawer, but not before making a small, swift pencil mark in a tiny notebook he kept beside it, a book much smaller than the main ledger. The detail was insignificant, a flicker of movement, but it snagged in Cole's mind. It didn't add up. Why record a cash sale in a separate book? He paid for the supplies in coin, took the heavy sack, and left without another word. The storekeeper's false concern felt more dangerous than an open threat. As he rode out of town, Cole knew that the arrangement was no longer just about filling a table. There was something else here. A debt that felt like a trap, and a storekeeper who held the key. He filed the image of the second book away, a piece of a puzzle he was just beginning to see. The summer heat, which had been a constant, oppressive blanket, began to curdle. The sky turned a bruised, greenish-yellow, and the air grew thick and heavy, charged with a silent, waiting energy. Cole, watching the horizon from the small rise behind the cabin, felt the change in his bones. He had seen skies like this before. They were liars. They promised rain and delivered violence. "A storm is coming," he said to My Lin that evening, his voice flat with certainty. "A bad one." She looked at the sky, her brow furrowed with worry. Her small garden, her family's only defense against the coming winter, was just beginning to produce. A heavy rain could wash it all away, leaving them with nothing. For the next day, a strange quiet fell over the homestead. And Leanne stayed close to the cabin, watching Cole as he worked. He wasn't preparing for rain, he was preparing for a flood. He spent hours hauling large rocks from the hillside, packing them along the low side of the creek bed that bordered their garden. He used the repaired axe to cut thick branches of greasewood, weaving them into a rough but sturdy barrier, packing the gaps with mud and stones. He worked with a relentless, focused energy, saying little. My Lin watched him from the doorway, her own work forgotten. She saw not just a man at labor, but a man fighting a battle with a ghost he could see long before it arrived. The storm broke just after dusk. It did not begin with a gentle patter but with a sudden, violent roar, as if the sky had cracked open. Rain came down not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets. The world beyond the cabin walls dissolved into a churning chaos of water and noise. The creek, normally a placid trickle, began to swell, its voice changing from a murmur to a hungry growl. My Lin lit an extra lantern, her face pale in the flickering light. Leanne was crying softly, huddled against her mother. And stood by the single window, his face pressed to the glass, reporting on the rising water. "It's over the banks, Mama. It's in the corn." Just when it seemed the small cabin itself might be washed from its foundation, Cole appeared at the door, drenched and covered in mud, his face grim. "The barrier won't hold much longer," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "We need to reinforce it." There was no question of staying inside. This was a fight for their future, for every bean and every potato. Mylin grabbed a worn shawl and pulled on his father's old coat, and they followed Cole out into the maelstrom. The force of the wind and rain was staggering. The creek was a brown, churning torrent, tearing at the makeshift levee Cole had built. For the next hour, they fought the storm side by side. Cole worked with the strength of two men, heaving rocks into place while the water surged around his knees. Mylin and Ann worked just as fiercely, dragging branches, packing mud, their small forms pitted against the immense power of the flood. Even little Leanne, her fear forgotten in the face of the family's unified effort, carried small stones in her skirt to her mother. They were no longer a widow and two children with a stranger. They were a single unit, a small, stubborn island of defiance in the heart of the storm. They fought until they were exhausted, until their muscles screamed and they were coated in mud, but the line held. The water crested, lapped at the very edge of the garden, and then, slowly, began to recede. They stumbled back into the cabin, soaked and shivering, but victorious. The garden was saved. As Mylin stoked the fire, her hands trembling with cold and exhaustion, she looked at Cole. He was leaning against the wall, his eyes closed, the water dripping from his hair onto the floor. In that moment, she saw past the gunslinger, past the quiet stranger. She saw the man who had seen the danger they could not, and who had stood between them and ruin. Later, wrapped in dry blankets and sipping hot tea, the silence in the cabin was different. The storm still raged outside, but inside, a new kind of quiet had settled, one of comfort and shared survival. The walls of the cabin seemed to have expanded, making room for him. "Why?" Mylin asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the warm air between them. It was not about the storm. It was about everything. Why help them? Why stay? Cole opened his eyes. He looked at the fire for a long time before he answered. "I had a place like this once," he said, his voice low and raspy. "A wife. A boy, a little older than Ann. A girl, just about Leanne's size." He paused, the memories moving like shadows across his face. "We were on our way to Oregon. We built a small cabin for the winter. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't." He didn't need to say the words. Fever. A blizzard. A helplessness more profound than any flood. "I learned to watch the sky," he continued, his gaze distant. "I learned to see what's coming. I just learned it too late for them." The confession laid his own wound bare. His quiet competence, his habit of preparing for the worst, his refusal to ask for anything, it was all born from a single, catastrophic failure. He was not just a drifter, he was a man doing penance, trying to repay a debt to ghosts. Mylin looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not his strength, but his sorrow, a sorrow that mirrored her own. She reached out and refilled his cup of tea. It was a small thing, but it was everything. He was no longer a stranger. He was a man who understood loss. News of the gunslinger staying with the Chinese widow traveled through town on whispers and sideways glances. Mr. Gable heard them all. The arrangement troubled him. It represented a change, a variable he could not control. A woman with a provider was not a woman he could easily manipulate. One afternoon, he hitched his buggy and drove out to the homestead, his face arranged in an expression of paternal concern. He found them in the yard. Cole was showing Ann how to properly fletch an arrow. Mylin was weeding the garden, Leanne at her side. The scene was one of quiet domesticity, and it hardened something in Gable's eyes. "Mrs. Way," he called out, his voice smooth as oil. "I heard about the storm. I came to see if you were all right." He held up a small sack of flour as if it were a holy offering. Mylin straightened up, her expression guarded. "We are fine, Mr. Gable. Thank you for your concern." Gable's eyes flickered to Cole, then back to Mylin. "It is a dangerous world for a woman alone," he said, letting the words hang in the air. "With all the trouble you have, especially with your husband's outstanding account." He pulled the large ledger from his buggy. "I was looking it over this morning. With the interest, I'm afraid the number has grown." He opened the book, showing her a page of spidery script and figures that made no sense to her. The final number was larger than before, an impossible sum. "That cannot be right," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "The numbers do not lie," Gable said, his tone still gentle. He looked directly at Cole now. "A man like this," he said, gesturing with his head, "a man with a gun, he brings trouble. People in town are talking. It would be a shame if the sheriff had to come out here, asking questions. A real shame if you were found to be harboring a vagrant." The threat was delivered with the pleasantness of a man discussing the weather. He was weaponizing the town's prejudice, using it as a shield for his own avarice. He was telling her to get rid of Cole, or he would bring the full weight of the law down on her. He left the sack of flour on the ground, a final, insulting gesture of his power, and drove away. Mylin stood frozen, the ledger's impossible number burned into her mind. The fragile piece of their home had been shattered. That night, she could not sleep. She looked at her sleeping children, at the quiet strength of the man sleeping by the cold ashes of his fire outside. Gable was right about one thing. He was a danger to them, because they were a danger to him. She could not let him be hurt because of her family. Before dawn, she rose and packed a small bundle, her mother's ivory comb, the few coins she had saved, a change of clothes for the children. An exit, kept ready. When Cole rose, she was waiting for him, the bundle at her feet. "You must go," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "This is not your fight." Cole looked at her, at the exhaustion in her eyes, at the small, desperate bundle on the ground. He understood what it represented. He had lived with a packed bag for years. He thought of Gable's smug face, of the flicker of movement with the second, smaller book. He thought of the impossible number in the ledger. "He is cheating you," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "It does not matter," she insisted. "He is powerful. You cannot fight him. Please, Cole. Go. Before he brings trouble to you." He looked at her, at the fierce, protective love that made her willing to face ruin alone just to keep him safe. He looked at the cabin, at the garden they had saved together. "It is my fight now," he said quietly. He turned and walked toward town, his shoulders set with a grim resolve. He had a debt to uncover. Cole knew he couldn't face Gable with fists or threats. The man was insulated by his position, his veneer of respectability. The only weapon that could defeat him was the truth, and the truth was hidden in that small, secret ledger. He needed a plan, one that required precision, not force. He found an by the creek, skipping stones across the water. "And," he said, sitting beside him, "I need your help. It might be dangerous." And stopped, his face serious. He had seen Gable's visit. He had seen the fear in his mother's eyes. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice steady. Cole explained the plan. It was simple, but everything depended on timing. An's role was crucial. He had to create a distraction, something loud and messy enough to pull Gable to the back of the store for a full minute. An listened, his eyes wide, but he did not waver. "I can do it," he said. The next afternoon, they rode into town. And slipped around to the alley behind the mercantile while Cole waited across the street, watching. A few minutes later, there was a tremendous crash from the back of the store, followed by the sound of shouting. And had tipped over a pyramid of empty barrels. As expected, Gable came storming out the back door, yelling about vandals and hooligans. That was Cole's cue. He moved across the street, silent as a shadow, and slipped through the front door of the empty store. His eyes swept the counter. He saw the main ledger, open as always. Beside the cash drawer, tucked beneath a stack of invoices, was the small, cloth-bound notebook. He took it. He didn't run. He simply turned and walked back out, melting into the afternoon crowds just as Gable was stomping back into the front of the store, muttering to himself. That evening, by the light of a single lantern, he and My Lin looked at the book. It was all there. Page after page of cash transactions, recorded with dates and names. And next to some of those names, including her husband's, were the real amounts they had paid on their credit accounts, payments Gable had never recorded in the official ledger. He had been systematically robbing them all, using the official ledger to inflate their debts with interest until he could seize their property or, in My Lin's case, keep her in a state of permanent servitude. The proof was undeniable. The next day, Cole did not ride into town alone. My Lin was beside him, and Lian riding on night behind them. They walked into the mercantile together. The store was busy. The sheriff was there, sipping a coffee. It was exactly what Cole had hoped for. He walked to the counter. Gable looked up, his smile faltering when he saw My Lin and the children. "What is this?" he demanded. Cole said nothing. He simply placed the small notebook on the counter next to the large, open ledger. "Sheriff," he said, his voice calm and clear. "I believe you'll find these two books tell different stories." He opened the small book to the pages with Li Wei's name. "Mr. Gable is a careful man," Cole said to the silent, watching crowd. "He keeps two sets of records. One for the debts, and one for the cash he pockets." He pointed to the entries, showing the payments that had been made but never credited. He turned the page. The Miller family. The Ortegas. They were his customers, too. They both lost their farms to him last year. A murmur went through the crowd. The sheriff put down his coffee and stepped forward, picking up the small book. He compared it to the main ledger. The color drained from Gable's face. He was a man made of bluster and lies, and without them, he collapsed. He sputtered, he denied, but the plain, quiet evidence on the counter damned him completely. He had been seen for what he was. My Lin had not said a word, but she had stood beside Cole the entire time, her presence a silent, powerful testimony. Her fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, unyielding strength. When it was over, when the sheriff was leading a deflated, stammering Gable away, they turned and walked out of the store into the sunlight, a family. The ride home was different. The silence was not heavy with worry or unspoken words, but light with relief, with a future that was suddenly their own. When they reached the cabin, the lamp she had lit that morning was still burning in the window, a small, welcoming star. Cole helped the children down, and his eyes met My Lin's over the saddle. He had never asked to stay. She had never asked him to. His bedroll was still outside, a symbol of his temporary place in their lives. Her own small bundle was still by the door, a reminder of her readiness to flee. She went inside. He watched as she walked to the bundle, knelt, and slowly, deliberately, began to unpack it. She put her mother's comb back on the small shelf. She put the coins away in a tin box. She was putting away her escape. She was choosing to stay. Then she turned to the small table. She set out for bowls. For sets of chopsticks. She looked at him then, and for the first time, a small, true smile touched her lips. She said his name, not as a label, but as an invitation. "Cole," she said. "Stay." It was the only word that mattered. He looked at the home they had fought for, at the woman who had met his quiet strength with her own, at the children who had become his own to watch over. He gave a single, slow nod. He was home. He walked inside, and she gestured to the table. She filled his bowl first, piling it high with the best portions, the largest share. He had arrived with nothing, and had been given everything. Thank you for watching.